Prize and with a generous grant from the Helen Jones Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Leslie Wolf, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Okay, thank you, Joe. And I see lots of familiar names in the participant list, which is really exciting. So thank you all for joining us. I am Dr. Leslie Wolf. I'm assistant professor in art history here at Texas Tech. And it is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce today's speaker. Claudia E. Zapata is a curatorial assistant of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and is a doctoral candidate at Southern Methodist University in art history. They received their BA and MA in art history from the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in classic Maya art. Their research interests include curatorial methodologies, identity-based exhibitions, Chicanx and Latinx art, digital humanities, BIPOC zines, and designer toys. Zapata has curated exhibitions at Mexicarte Museum in Austin and other Texas institutions. And they have published articles in Panhandle Plains Historical Review, Joyas, Aslan, Hemisphere, and El Mundo Cerdo 7. So I would just like to briefly add, before turning things over, that I had the privilege of first meeting Claudia back in 2012, which we just determined it was 2012, when I was a graduate intern with Mexicarte Museum in Austin, where Claudia was a curator. And it was a really formative time for me. I was so excited and compelled by the way in which Claudia and their colleagues were occupying and intervening in multiple ways and multiple sites across the arts of the city. So for me, Claudia's work really encapsulates both a rigorous, what I would say is a research-based practice, and also a practice-based research that I think stands at the avant-garde of art histories of the Americas today. I also want to plug, I'm gonna lift this up, this truly groundbreaking and extensive catalog for the exhibition that Claudia will discuss today, and to encourage everyone to pick up a copy. I really think it's critical reading in the art history of this country. So I strongly encourage that read. And finally, before I turn things over, I want to remind everyone to, as Joe said, put any questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and at any point throughout the talk. Today's lecture is also being recorded and will be made available on our Landmark Arts website. I also would like to thank Joe Arredondo, the Landmark Arts Program and the School of Art, and the Helen Jones Foundation for all of the logistical and financial support for this event. So without further ado, let's give a warm virtual welcome to Claudia Zapata.
Thanks, Leslie. That was nice. I like the way that you described my practice. So I'm going to basically take you through a little tour of the exhibition. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. So the exhibition, Printing the Revolution, The Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to now, is at the Smithsonian American Art Museum's main building in Washington, D.C. The exhibition features 119 works featuring screen prints, digital graphics, augmented reality works, and site-specific installations by more than 74 artists of Mexican descent and other artists who were active in Chicanx networks. All of the artworks on display are part of the museum's permanent collection of Latinx art, one of the leading national collections of its kind and one of the most extensive collections of Chicanx graphics in an American art-focused museum. This exhibition features donated artworks from major collectors and recently acquired works as part of an ambitious program to create an inclusive view of American art. Acting head curator and curator of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, E. Carmen Damos, curated this exhibition, and I acted as the project's curatorial assistant. The show's development begins with Tomás Ibarra Frausto's print donation in 1995. One of the renowned scholars of Chicano art, Tomás has been advocating for Chicano art study, representation, and display across the nation since the 1960s. His early donations to the Smithsonian were part of an effort to preserve and share his personal collection he had amassed over the years as an activist, scholar, and collector. I recommend watching the online interview available on Smithsonian American Art Museum's YouTube channel that features interviews with Carmen and Tomas, as well as other graphics collectors, Gil Cardenas, Harriet Enragada Romo, and Rosa Terrazas on behalf of her aunt, Margaret Terrazas Santos. In these conversations, they explain their individual collecting practices and how these efforts were fueled by Chicano activism. Interesting to note, Margaret Terrazas Santos' estate was a later addition within our research process after someone contacted one of our catalog essayists. This is the first appearance of Santos' collection in a major exhibition. The show's research process was a multi-year project. Since 2018, Carmen and I interviewed Chicanx and Latinx scholars, curators, and artists, eventually conducting studio visits with prospective artists, collectors, and print centers across the nation. The exhibition preparation was really twofold. We were curating for the exhibition, as well as acquiring artwork with the objective of enhancing the museum's permanent collection. Printing the Revolution is a permanent collection exhibition, meaning all the works on display are part of the museum's holdings. Usually this type of exhibition format is meant to tout the institution's collecting vision. In this case, we were filling in gaps and remedying years of non-collecting. A Chicano exhibition is incredibly challenging, given the complexity of the term Chicano. This concept is a nuanced term that if you ask someone what it means, you may receive several different interpretations. Typically, scholars cite Ruben Salazar, the esteemed journalist who was killed by an LA County Sheriff's tear gas projectile during the National Chicano Moratorium in 1870. A foundational definition by the slain journalist is, quote, a Chicano is a Mexican American with a non-Anglo image of himself, end quote. The often quoted definition highlights the Chicano movement's challenge to white supremacy and the decolonial consciousness of those employing the term, yet it also reaffirms its limitations by reducing the Chicano framework to an engendered Mexican-American male perspective. Feminists within the movement decried gender inequity and countered with the feminine ending Chicana, and now Chicanx with the non-binary suffix is the latest conceptual reinterpretation. Often the Chicano movement conjures scenes from the 1960s and 70s of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers movement and their march to the California Capitol. The movement consisted of several concurrent efforts, including the UFW, as well as the student protests and walkouts in LA, the Raza Unida Party that developed out of Texas, and national anti-Vietnam efforts. Printing the Revolution explores the rise of Chicano graphics within these early social movements and the ways in which Chicanx artists since then have advanced innovative printmaking practices attuned to social justice. We break down the exhibition into these sections: urgent images, a new Chicano world, reimagining national and global histories, and within this, changemakers, and finally, digital innovations and public interventions. Works from as early as 1966 to 2020 intermingle, exemplifying the timelessness of many of these messages. In our first section, Urgent Images, we feature works like UFW artist Andy Zermeño. Zermeño created Huelga, meaning strike in Spanish, as his first poster for the United Farm Workers. Don Sotaco, the recurring figure in Zermeño's posters and political cartoons, is a representative striker whose honorific title, Don, conveys respect. Dressed in tattered pants and with a hole in her shoe, Don Sotaco rushes forward with a sense of agency as well as urgency. Zermeño recalled, quote, I was trying to show the spirit of the workers who were attacking the status quo, end quote. Brandishing a UFW flag proclaiming the strike, Don Sotaco, and by extension the union, calls for action from farm workers and their supporters. The urgency in this early political advocacy, particularly with the UFW support, is a common theme. For example, this untitled work on computer tractor paper advertises a Gallo Wines boycott. During the civil rights era, artists often used whatever materials they had on hand to craft public messages about pressing concerns. Here, an unidentified artist emblazons a pro-labor message on recycled computer paper, calling for the boycott of Gaio wines. Activists on college campuses were especially known for using this unconventional paper for their printmaking. The artist depicts a rat, a symbol of non-union workers who crossed the picket line, most likely a continuation of the rat iconography used by Parisian protesters in 1968. Contesting police brutality is another prominent theme in the exhibition. Amado Peña's 1975 print, Aquellos que han muerto, Those Who Have Died, references the wrongful death of 12-year-old Santos Rodriguez in 1973 that galvanized the Mexican-American community of Dallas, Texas, and garnered national attention. The young boy was killed when a police officer tried to coerce a confession from him and his brother using Russian roulette. Peña's memorial print honors the boy and other victims of violence whose names appear beneath Rodriguez's bloodied face. The emotional toll of documenting this tragedy through his art ultimately led Peña to abandon civil rights-related subjects. We feature this print across from a contemporary installation by Bay Area artist Odi Original. His Black Lives Matter movement-inspired project, Justice for Our Lives, is an ongoing online and public social justice artwork. Using photographs, Original creates black and white digital portraits of people killed during altercations with law enforcement. The artist makes each portrait available for download for community members to use. He also creates dynamic, wheat-pasted public interventions throughout the Bay Area. This next section, A New Chicano World, reflects Chicano artists wielding their new political lens. The reclamation of the term Chicano, which was previously a pejorative for Mexican Americans, signified a pivotal societal change by rejecting cultural assimilation. Chicano artists challenged patriarchal, heteronormative, and colonial perspectives to create artworks showcasing the diversity of their daily life and their communities. This approach inspired other artists to use printmaking to explore their bicultural current in U.S. American life. Gilbert Magu Lujan's 1986 print, Cruising Turtle Island, features a fantastical imagined landscape where Chicano culture is dominant. Cruising Turtle Island, which references a native name for North America, pictures indigenous figures riding Chicano lowriders and speaking through ancient Mesoamerican speech scrolls. The anthropomorphic dog, seen at the lower right, is a common figure in Magu's art that he employed in his words as, quote, a metaphor for indigenous Mexican Indian heritage, end quote. This interconnectivity and citation of ancient iconography and civilizations, as well as native heritage, is a common thread throughout the exhibition. In this print, La Curandera, the Healer, by Texas artist Carmen Lomas Garza, we see the overlapping of Mexican Catholicism and indigenous practices. The scene captures a spiritual cleansing ritual known as a limpia, and other indigenous practices such as the burning of copal or tree resin incense. In the background, you can see other spiritual references such as the Virgin of Guadalupe, showcasing the diversity of her family's faith. Carmen Lomas Garza is part of a practice of artists providing nostalgic snapshots from their past, featuring the unique cultural practices that make up their Chicanx life. Chicano artists also delved into daily life through familiar artistic formats. There's a legacy of calendar art stemming from Mexico that continues today. Chicano print centers and artists would use the calendar months as part of a print portfolio, with several artists contributing to a set. Max E. Garcia and Luis C. Gonzalez used the calendar format to critique then U.S. President Gerald Ford and comment on food insecurity, featuring an image of food stamps overlaid with Christ's Last Supper scene. Many artists grew up surrounded by illustrated calendars hanging in their homes, given as gifts by local stores. These signs commonly portray scenes of Mexican indigenous myth. Mexican commercial art from 1940s and 50s, which featured most famously works by the painter Jesus Elguera, inspired the calendar genre. His paintings and illustrations are epic dramatizations of Mexican myths rendered in a classicizing realist style. These images continue to circulate today in calendars gifted by local businesses like bakeries and mechanic shops. Queer Chicana and Chicanx artists reference and reclaim canonical spiritual and cultural figures, commenting on issues of gender and sexuality. Chicana Yaqui artist Esther Hernandez reimagines the Marian image, the Virgin of Guadalupe, in her print La Ofrenda, the Offering. Using her then partner as a model, Hernandez subtly conveys intimacy between the two women. The artist's hand offers a rose to her partner, whose back is emblazoned with the Virgin of Guadalupe tattoo. In 1991, when this image became the cover of Carla Trujillo's book, Chicana Lesbians, The Girls Our Mother Warned Us About, it became more widely associated with the lesbian community and sexual desire between women. Julio Salgado's 2014 screenprint, Quiero Mis Queerse, reflects on the artist's struggle with his gender expression. Inspired by Frida Kahlo's well-known painting Las Dos Fridas, The Two Fridas, Salgado employs a similar duality to reflect on his challenges as a gay teen hiding his femininity. As a young man, Salgado wanted a 15th birthday celebration, or a quinceañera, a traditional coming-out ceremony reserved for young women. When the artist turned 30, he created this image. He said to, quote, honor the little boy who didn't get a quinceañera, end quote. This celebration has a communal abbreviation of quince, or 15, and the artist reforms the word to create a new queer quinceañera term known as queerse. An integral aspect of the Printing the Revolution exhibition is the relationship between Chicano artists and their graphic networks, often in forms of cross-cultural collaboration. Pepe Coronado, a Dominican-American artist, joined the Sere Project in the 1990s. Sere Project is an artist residency program based out of Austin, Texas, originally founded by Chicano printmaker and painter Sam Coronado. Pepe Coronado and Sam Coronado, no relation, worked together in this fledgling residency, with Pepe eventually becoming a master printer in the 1990s. The collaborative spirit and artistic vision he witnessed among Chicano and Latino artists at the Print Center left a strong impression. Based in part on this example, he later founded the Dominican York Proyecto Gráfica, a print collective dedicated to exploring Dominican diasporic history and culture. In the collective's first portfolio, Pepe references the Intrepido ship, juxtaposing images and text that comment on the 1965 U.S. intervention in the Dominican Republic. In the next section, Reimagining National and Global Histories, we gather artists critically reflecting and challenging the interpretation of significant moments in U.S. and international history. Chicano artists and their collaborators saw themselves as part of a global movement that challenged injustice. Starting with the Cuban Revolution and the Vietnam War, artists interrogated world events and expressed solidarity with other aggrieved groups. To make their revisionist histories accessible to a wide public, artists sold prints at affordable prices, exhibited their works at alternative art centers they often founded themselves, and adopted the bold graphic style of post-revolutionary Cuban poster artists such as René Medeiros. Chicano civil rights activists connected their efforts in the context of the United States to global liberation movements challenging the dictatorships and colonial regimes. For example, Malaquías Montoya's Julio 26, Cuba, Vietnam, y Nosotros Venceremos, weds imagery of the Cuban Revolution and Vietnam with the Chicano struggle at home by adding the word nosotros, or us, to the text. The phrase Julio 26, or July 26th, references Fidel Castro's successful guerrilla movement that toppled the military dictatorship of Cuban President Fulgencio Batista in 1959. Latin American solidarity and the critique of U.S. intervention and imperialism writ large defines this section. While working at La Raza Silkscreen print shop in San Francisco, El Salvadorian artist Herbert Sigüenza colored and amplified the reach of a print created by an unidentified artist that appropriates two characters from Milton Caneff's comics to critique U.S. intervention in El Salvador. The Ben-Day dots on the figures recall Roy Lichtenstein's pop canvases, but the poster's text delivers a surprising punch that parodies the military might of U.S. foreign policy during the Reagan administration. This print was extremely popular in San Francisco, home to the artist's family, as well as many other El Salvadorians that fled their war-torn country and settled in the United States. Chicago artist Eric J. Garcia, in his Chicano Codices #1, represents the alternative graphic forms we acquired. Using the Codex format, an accordion-style book associated with Mesoamerican civilizations, Garcia satirizes the events and aftermath of the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. He personifies the United States as Uncle Sam and Mexico as a welcoming person unaware of Uncle Sam's ambitions. The artist's portrayal of Uncle Sam recalls political cartoons produced in the early 20th century, a period of U.S. imperialist expansion in the Caribbean and Pacific. The history of manifest destiny, or the idea that the United States was destined to inhabit a large swath of North America, from sea to shining sea, are central themes for Chicano artists. The Mexican-American War, which resulted in Mexico ceding the Southwest and California to the U.S., is a recurring historical marker. The artist's personal experience as a member of the U.S. Air Force who was stop-lossed or mandated to have an involuntary extension of service led him to portray military critiques throughout his artistic career. Several works in the exhibition served as informational posters meant to provide contact resources for organizations' advocacy efforts. Chinese-American artist Nancy Hom created No More Hiroshima, Nagasaki's medical aid for the hibakushas in 1982 for several Asian organizations. Using a style that recalls the graphic forms and bold color of Cuban posters, Hom calls attention to the medical needs of hibakushas, the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings in 1945 who suffered illnesses stemming from their exposure to radiation. Hom directed the Kearny Street Workshop, an Asian American art center modeled after the Chicano and Latino arts organization Galeria de la Raza. She was part of a supportive network of cross-cultural artists in San Francisco who shared a common interest in global struggles. San Francisco and the Bay Area are well represented in this exhibition as critical points of artistic international exchange. Several artists in the exhibition emigrated to this area from Latin America, like Chilean printer Dene Castro. He played an essential role in the printmaking scene in the Bay Area, co-creating Mission Grafica, the graphic studio within the historic nonprofit Mission Cultural Center for Latino Arts, with fellow printer Joss Sanzis. In his fundraising calendar print for the month of September and October, he uses this format to remember the solemn events surrounding another momentous September 11th. In 1973, the state would mark when Augusto Pinochet led a coup against democratically elected socialist President Salvador Allende in Chile. Castro includes portraits of Allende and Orlando Letelier, Allende's exiled foreign minister who was assassinated in Washington, D.C. on September 21st, 1976. The artist also references Pablo Neruda, Chile's most celebrated poet, who died days after the coup on September 23rd, and the deaths of Mexican boxer Salvador Sanchez and Che Guevara in the Bolivian jungles. The print stands as a personal testimony of sorts. Castro was arrested by Pinochet's forces and spent 2 years tortured in prison before being released to come to the United States. The dictator Pinochet ruled Chile until 1990, and Castro has since returned to Chile. Subsection Changemakers groups Chicanx artists and their collaborators to focus on their use of portraiture. Many artists recognize that the lives and deeds of those who have fought for political, civil, and human rights are excluded in school books or curricula. To challenge these omissions, artists choose to highlight individuals past and present whose actions have shaped the course of history. Many of these portraits rely on historic photographs and quote their sitters or recount their achievements. Employed in this way, portraiture becomes a useful vehicle that shifts attention away from privilege, self-aggrandizement, and vanity toward activism, sacrifice, and social transformation. Rene Castro features Victor Jara, a leftist folk singer who was apprehended, tortured, and killed during the early days of Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile. Here he depicts a youthful Jara, rendered in intense colors alongside a hopeful lyric from one of his songs. Castro often created prints to raise awareness of international struggles against dictatorship and war, especially those marked by U.S. intervention. Mexican revolutionary figures continue to be symbolic iconography for political resistance. Leonard Castellanos' featured print Rifa includes a psychedelic-hued portrait of Emiliano Zapata, one of the celebrated leaders of the Mexican Revolution. Chicano artists saw themselves as continuing Zapata's resistance efforts for land and indigenous rights. Beneath the portrait, the artist includes the Chicano slang phrase "rifa," which means "we are the best." This boastful reference is common among early Chicano art's iconography. Labor leaders are a prominent subject of Chicano portraiture and are ever present throughout the exhibition. Major Chicano printmaker Rupert Garcia includes an Emma Tenayuca portrait for this Chicano Studies conference promotional poster. To create this print, Garcia relied on a historical photograph of Emma Tenayuca. In 1938, labor organizer and community activist Tenayuca led a successful pecan chiller strike in San Antonio. Her prolific activism began in her teen years, and she remained on the front lines of labor organization until she was forced to leave Texas out of fear for her safety. In their work, Chicano artists frequently resurrect early radical figures such as Tenayuca to reveal precursors to Chicano activism. This 1977 poster promotes one of the earliest convenings of the National Caucus of Chicano Social Scientists, later known as the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies. Formed in 1972, the organization remains dedicated to supporting and disseminating Chicanx scholarship. Barbara Carrasco chose to create a portrait of Dolores Huerta at a time when the groundbreaking labor organizer was sadly underrecognized for her pivotal role as the co-founder of the United Farm Workers Union. Since the 1950s, Dolores Huerta has been a tireless advocate for the rights of workers, immigrants, and women. Along with Cesar Chavez, Huerta co-founded the pivotal United Farm Workers. Huerta was the labor union's chief lobbyist and contract negotiator, and she coined the popular phrase, "Si se puede." Now, 90 years later, Huerta continues to be a respected public voice. This brightly hued print, which references Huerta by first name only, urges viewers to recognize feminist leadership. The close-up of Huerta's face also recalls Andy Warhol's celebrity portraits, casting a beautiful and tireless labor leader as a new kind of icon. Our final section, Digital Innovations and Public Interventions, is dedicated to artists continuing to expand the concept of graphics and featuring those that think beyond the confines of the paper form. Through public interventions and digital methods, Chicanx artists have thrust graphics into innovative conduits of exchange. At the same time, they continue the legacy of political graphics and address transhistorical issues such as environmental justice, immigrant rights, international solidarity, and LGBTQ plus rights and visibility. Using new technologies in digital printing, the internet, social media, and augmented reality, artists today call for a fluid interpretation of graphics that allows them to infiltrate broader public and private spaces with calls for action and awareness. In the 1980s, Chicana artist Barbara Carrasco used digital graphics to model innovative ways of reaching a mass audience on the street. The Public Art Fund invited her to present a computer-generated work on an 800 square foot digital billboard in the middle of New York's Times Square. Frame by frame, Carrasco electronically shouted the harmful effects of chemical pesticides, following their path from a dust cropper spraying fields to a farm worker picking grapes and falling ill, and finally to a consumer's rejection and subsequent boycott of the poisoned grapes. Public intervention's strategic nature and reliance on site specificity is key to this Elizabeth Cisco, Louis Hawk, and David Avalos' 1980 work, Welcome to America's Finest Tourist Plantation. Designed to appear in the advertising space on the sides of San Diego city buses, Welcome to America's Finest Tourist Plantation is a fierce rebuttal to San Diego's nickname, America's Finest City, coined by Mayor Pete Wilson in 1972. From left, a dishwasher cleans food scraps off a plate, an armed guard handcuffs a subject, and a hand reaches for a hotel door with a placard requesting housekeeping. The matching brown hands racialize the labor pool, and their apprehension by law enforcement suggests their undocumented status. Through image and text, the work questions the myth of the U.S. as a, quote, nation of immigrants. The public reaction generated by this art project demonstrates how the graphic arts can serve as a catalyst for dialogue. This work was released around the time San Diego was hosting the Super Bowl. So people were really upset, FYI. We feature early Chicana digital art that has rarely been featured in major exhibitions, such as Chicana artist Alma Lopez's Our Lady. Using Photoshop, Lopez created Our Lady to reclaim the colonial Mexican image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Historically, the, quote, immaculately rendered image of the Virgin is part of colonial Mexican mythology and is a recurring image throughout Latin America and in Chicanx visual culture. In this digital bricolage, Lopez confronts and dismantles the restrictive heteronormativity that the Catholic Church-sanctioned Virgin embodies. Her digital collage integrates digitized postcards, photographs, and digital graphics, resulting in a multidimensional overlapping. By infusing popular images from working-class Chicana visual culture with, quote, high technology, Lopez digitally disassembles the Virgin icon to create her own queer one. The artist self-identifies her digital editing as a form of queering her Mexican cultural ephemera, such as Loteria cards and Virgin of Guadalupe and Coyolxauhqui images. The Coyolxauhqui stone is a prominent monolith in Mexican visual memory. Found in Tenochtitlan, present-day Mexico City, this monolith was unearthed at the foot of the Templo Mayor, the principal temple for the Aztecs. The nude woman is dismembered, and this image captures her mythic death. According to legend, Coyolxauhqui was a daughter of Coatlicue, who resided on Coatepec or Snake Mountain. After Coatlicue miraculously became pregnant from a ball of feathers, Coyolxauhqui and her 400 siblings attempted to kill their mother. The unborn child, known as Huitzilopochtli, emerged fully grown to slay Coyolxauhqui and her siblings. Lopez props up this Coyolxauhqui figure from its original flat orientation and adapts the disc figure to serve as her virgin's cloak. This mythic figure is part of survivor narratives for contemporary feminist artwork, with artists seeing Coyolxauhqui as a goddess figure combating patriarchal rulership. Shareable graphics are a new chapter to the study of Chicanx art history, with artists disseminating their digital images across the internet and social media platforms. Artists distribute these works to aid in solidarity efforts, political protests, and social advocacy. Some shareable graphics are meant to continue their circulation in physical form, with artists providing a higher quality image for people to download and print. Others primarily exist in online forums geared toward inciting dialogue and creating a wider network distribution. At no cost to audiences, shareable graphics function as did early protest posters in efforts to gain momentum for social causes and assert the presence of marginalized groups. However, in this digital space, online dialogue emerges between users and graphics that offers unprecedented exposure, user interactivity, and interpretation. Political cartoonist and media maker Lalo Alcaraz created I Stand With Emma for mass distribution. In February 2018, high school senior Emma Gonzalez survived the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Days later, they gave an impassioned speech on live television advocating for stronger gun control. Alcaraz digitally illustrated Gonzalez's portrait after watching their televised address. He then posted it on his social media channels, asking people to distribute it online or download a high-resolution file from its website for personal printing. The image features "We Call BS," a line from Gonzalez's speech. In the lower register, hashtag gun control now and hashtag stand with the kids add to the social media-centered trending tags used to lobby for solidarity and gun reform. In a 2012 post on the microblogging site Tumblr, Julio Salgado sought out other people like him who were undocumented and queer, or undocuqueers, as the artist calls them. While he did not create the term, he has been a leader in popularizing its usage, especially on online networks. For this undocuqueer project, Salgado asked undocumented followers for a photo of themselves and a personal reflection on their intersectional identities. The artist turned these images and statements into works that circulate on digital platforms and provide undocuqueer online users with a sense of community and empowerment. Salgado's artistic activism has made him one of the most recognizable dreamers and DACA recipients in the United States. And in my final image of this exhibition tour, we center on the augmented reality prints of the exhibition. This 2015 AR print by Texas artist Zeke Peña, titled A Nomad in Love, showcases the innovative new era printmaking has entered. To create the print, Peña worked with master printer Arturo Negrete to create the physical print, and David Figueroa of Augment El Paso in Texas for the animations. Using the free Augment El Paso app and positioning the camera on their device in front of the enhanced print, viewers experience the integrated overlaid animations. The app triggers several animated sequences, including a hummingbird that rapidly flutters, motion lines that emit from a spring neck self-portrait, and a personified coyote with a visible heart that howls against a rotating rabbit-shaped moon. Peña often uses the coyote as a double for himself, given their shared love of running around in the El Paso desert and playful personalities. Peña uses these digital animations to heighten the viewer's experience of his constructed world. Developing an exhibition about political graphics against the backdrop of COVID-19, mass uprisings, museum closures, teleworking, and the Capitol insurrection was a constant challenge, especially for DC, that forced us to constantly adapt to the situation. We tried to capture the zeitgeist with our last acquisitions for the exhibition project, these two additional portraits by Ori Original of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. They make up part of the wheat paste installation at the entrance to the exhibition and barely made it into our catalog printing. This exhibition now needs a part 2, where many successive exhibitions to capture the onslaught of new work created during these uncertain times. The works of Printing the Revolution represent a long-standing tradition of resistance against oppression that, as we have seen in the last year, is vital to shaping the world we want and deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That's fantastic. It's so great to see all of those works and to see the animation. It's really fabulous. So I encourage everyone to contribute questions in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. And we have a few minutes for questions, maybe about 10-15 minutes. So while everyone is conjuring their questions, I guess I want to start. Let's see, where do I want to start? I want to start, I suppose, by thinking about, for me, I know that you have been so grounded in Texas, and you were grounded in Austin, and I know you have ties to Dallas, and you've curated a lot in Texas, thinking about Chicanx artistic production and Tejana artistic production and that context. But this is operating in a different sort of space on a national scale and through a national institution. And so you touched on this at the end of your talk just now, and thinking about the sort of tenuous backdrop of the moment of curating and assisting with the exhibition. But I'm just sort of curious how and to what extent you really felt like you had to grapple with the I don't know if they were competing interests or the kind of multiplicities that come from thinking through Chicanx art and Chicanographics on this kind of national scale, and specifically articulating them through a national institution. I'm wondering how that worked for you, how that felt for you, if that was a big pivot, and how and to what extent that might have shifted your perception of your own positionality relative to the field and that artistic practice.
Yeah, I think great question. I think my experience in Texas, especially working with so many works on paper, really helped the conversation because it's a very nuanced community, the printmakers, graphic producer. That's something that a lot of people aren't attuned to because they haven't delved into those communities or been in studios. The printmaking studio, luckily, while working in Austin, I worked with the Serie Project. I mentioned this in the presentation that was started by Sam Coronado, and he's now deceased. But when I was there, I was active in that studio at one point. So I remember what that experience was in terms of just running a print shop, the master printer artist relationship. What's fueling Sam Coronado is his experience having been in LA with self-help graphics and that format. So I've had experience of these legacies of print centers, mainly through the Texas lens, but as I had more experience with all the visits and all the conversations we had with everybody, it couldn't have just been a Texas-centric. I mean, as a Texan, I think you're always like, well, Texas is the best. It should be number one. Everything else doesn't matter. But in Chicano art history, actually it tends to be California. The California centricity is what's totally prevailed over time, and Texas is often secondary. So while most of the artwork in the show is coming from these two states, because it's a national institution, and it's so interesting. I mean, there was quite a bit of the culture shock going from Texas to DC, because there's so many things that needed to be explained, very 101. And as I mentioned, how difficult the Chicano identity in general is. And it's constantly changing. I mean, there's all these different manifestations of it by its users, by the youth, by everybody.